welcome back. Today, I figured we'd do something a bit more interesting this time around. Usually I've been doing these types of tier lists and discussion videos or whatever, but I figured this would be an interesting twist to what I usually put out. Granted, it's still a discussion video, but it's just one of those reflective type sort of things, rather than anything definitive. It basically is just one of those reflective sort of videos. Now, I will preface this by saying it's been 5 years. I don't remember everything, obviously. It's been a long time since this game came out, and if I get anything wrong or misconstrued, I apologize in advance. But that's also part of the reason why I'm not making this a tier list sort of thing. I'm just making it more of an analysis video. So you really won't see stuff oh, this is the best unit, outside of maybe a couple exceptions, because there are some I just absolutely remember. It's not going to be oh, this unit's better than this unit because XYZ. Basically, it's just, again, an analysis of whatever. I tried my best with this, but you'll have to let me know down below where I got stuff wrong or right or whatever, because I have a good feeling that I probably messed up somewhere. But we may as well just get started. Again, I have to preface this by saying this isn't a tier list. It's not a tier list, because I can't rank. It's been a long time since this meta. I can't tell you what's been common, what hasn't been common. I can't tell you jack. I can't tell you anything. So I'm just going to do it based on the initial meta I remember specifically. I remember Hector, Takumi, and all those really well. But then outside of that, it's just kind of a mixed bag of well, where do these units lie? Because prior to skill inheritance, you had to make do with what you got. So that's where we're going to go in with this. And yeah, to start us off, we do have Hector. I do recall Hector being one of the biggest threats at launch, simply because of his innate distant counter and Armads, coming with built-in quick riposte 2, which did allow him to double no matter what in the enemy phase, which was pretty good. And then combine that with Pavis, he would be able to just overall take less damage, which was pretty nice. Goat Armor was kind of a dead skill, because outside of Hector, I don't recall there being a lot of decent armors to use, if any at all, simply because the one movement was a bit of a hindrance at the time. And then of course we also had units like Male Robin, who were pretty interesting because he was able to cover 2 colors, which happened to be the 2 colors that were pretty meta-defining at the time, those being red and colorless because of Ryoma and Takumi. So having the ability to counter red units and colorless units while having a pretty decent defense stat at launch was pretty nice, actually. Defiant Speed, if it were to ever go off, could allow him to double more frequently, and then Spurred Defense wasn't too bad for support, but that's assuming you have him backline, for example. So if you had a distant counter unit such as Xander in front of Robin, he would be able to cover both fronts, essentially because your melee unit wouldn't be prone to ranged threat, as opposed to someone like Selena, who would just get targeted by a ranged foe. Still, even then, you could body block with a melee unit, and other melee units would fall in line and just target the unit with one range, so the defense wasn't too bad. Of course, we had Ryoma, who was the fast distant counter unit with Astra, so that was pretty good at the time. He's still pretty decent to this day, thanks to the Raijinto refine. I don't remember Astra ever really being a good special to begin with, but it was still nice to have around anyway, just because it was a damaging special. And it did pair well with Defiant Attack, because obviously he would have more attack, so the extra boost he would get from Defiant would allow him to deal a lot more damage. And then Hold Speed 3 was just supportive in nature. It didn't really grant him anything, but it did allow him to bolster his allies quite a bit. And then of course, similar to Ryoma and Hector, we have Takumi, who had close counter, which was probably what sold him the most as one of the more meta-defining units. His attack wasn't too bad, and he had decent speed, especially with Threat Speed 3. Vengeance was whatever, but it was still a damaging special, but because of the fact that he had close counter meant that you can't really safely initiate on him unless you were either a mage or you had good speed, which was really hard to do at the time. Again, specifically because of Threat Speed 3, if you were to miss the kill, then he could easily just initiate on you and double you, and that'll be it. And as far as I remember, that was pretty much it for the meta. But of course, we did have some anti-meta units. Now, I recall Abel not really being too popular, but from my understanding, he's pretty anti-meta, simply because he does have Brave Lance Swordbreaker, so he could always pierce through those faster Ryomas. He didn't have to really worry about damage there. He had HP plus 5, which was pretty good for just increasing his overall bulk. And then if he were to charge up Aegis, which would be pretty easy to do with a Brave Lance. He would actually be able to take hits from ranged units, so he wouldn't be too prone to ranged threats as much, provided that they don't double him. But because of Brave Lance and Swordbreaker, he was actually just a really solid red check in general, which was pretty good. And then we had Leo. Leo, from what I remember, was a pretty decent tech unit with drawback or reposition support, mainly because Brynhildr inflicts gravity on the foes. So what he could have always done was target a foe who couldn't counterattack, inflict gravity, and then have an ally draw him back, which was pretty cool, especially when he came with Quick Riposte and Savage Blow, because if a ranged unit were to attack him, he would at least be able to counterattack as well, which was pretty nice. And then, again, if you were to initiate combat with Brynhildr, Savage Blow would just make it easier to take out ranged threats in the enemy phase. Granted, his defense wasn't exactly the best, but with Quick Riposte, he was able to double in the enemy phase no matter what, which was pretty good. And then we had Selena, who was basically just the Hector check, who also came with reposition. Honestly, as far as Selena goes nowadays, it's not really like the best, but Triangle Depth with Armor Slayer was pretty cool overall just for countering Hector in general. She also had good speed, meaning that she would be able to double a lot of other foes, which was pretty cool. And then because she also came with Triangle Adept, she would also be able to check green units, which wasn't bad at all, especially because her attack wasn't exactly the greatest and still isn't good to this day, but what can you do? It was launch units. Of course, she also came with reposition, which meant that if you were to pair her with Leo, for example, she could actually just act as a support unit. Leo can inflict gravity, and she could reposition them out, which at that point, she could just tank a hit if she really needed to. You could actually pair this with Robin as well, as I mentioned earlier, so she could get spur defense boost and actually eat hits pretty well. And then we had Setsuna, who was a mix of a support unit and a really decent combat unit. Her attack, again, really wasn't like the greatest, but Assassin Bow coming with Dagger Breaker and then coming with Innate Bow Breaker meant that ranged threats really couldn't do much unless they were magic. And even then, she had 37 speed, which was a lot of speed at the time. Of course, she also came with Reciprocal Aid and HP plus 5, meaning that she could actually heal her allies if she really needed to. But that would come at the cost of Bow Breaker, obviously. But still, the fact that she was able to counter bows, daggers, and flyers, for that matter, was actually pretty cool tech. And as far as I know, that was pretty much it for like the anti-meta. The rest of the units were either pretty much just combative or like a hybrid of sorts, or they didn't really have a niche or support. Like for example, we had Arthur, who was basically just a blue check unit. He came with Lancebreaker and Emerald Axe, so basically he wasn't really going to be doing damage to red units, but that didn't really matter for him because, again, he was basically just a check. He could always use swap on the unit if you need them to body block. And that was pretty much that. He also came with HP plus 5, so he had a pretty good bulk too. So yeah, no, it wasn't too bad there. We also had Camus, who came with a distant counter unit and Granny Shield, so he could basically act as another Ryoma in a sense, where he has the movement and he also has the ability to counterattack. It also did help that cavalry effective units weren't really common from what I remember, mainly because the top threats weren't even cavalry units. So I can see why this wasn't really as appealing. Still, the fact that he had pretty decent speed and a distant counter weapon actually made him pretty good overall. Of course, going back to the Triangle Adept units for a second, we had Cordelia, who didn't have like the most attack, but she had a Brave Lance and Gale Force, which was pretty cool, meaning that she could always initiate combat, and if she were to get Gale Force off after maybe like her third combat, or if she, that's assuming she kills twice in both combats, or if she were to quad in another combat and charge Gale Force there after eating a counterattack, she could actually just hit and run, which was pretty cool. Pass, I don't recall doing all too much, especially since Pass benefits more from the extra movement, so I don't recall this ever really being that effective. Of course, we also had other checks such as Eliwood, who also came with Axe Breaker, and had Durandal. Although his speed wasn't nearly as good as Selena's, he did have a lot more attack to boot. And honestly, you could have made the case that he was a bit anti-meta because he also had Axe Breaker, but I feel like the Triangle Depth is kind of what sold Selena, simply because she would basically be able to output a lot more damage against green units. That, and she also had pretty decent physical bulk, which Eliwood didn't have at the time, which is why I do think that maybe Selena was probably a bit better, especially since she also came with Reposition, while Eliwood only came with Sacred Cow, which was pretty much whatever. And then we also had Brave Bows, which were pretty cool for dealing damage. As far as Brave Bows went, Gordon wasn't exactly bad, but I remember when Klein came out, he was just monumentally better. Not only because he could potentially quad, because he didn't have the worst speed, especially if you were to give him like a rally speed or something, but he also came with Death Blow and Quick Riposte, meaning that he could output more damage than Gordon, and if he were to take a hit in the enemy phase, he could double anyway because of Quick Riposte. But you also had to worry about the speedy sword infantries, such as Corel, who came with Wudao, Reprisal, Defiant Attack, and Desperation. Basically, if he were to initiate combat on you, provided that he also had setup, he would be outputting a fair amount of damage because he would basically get 50 effective attack and would be able to double before the foe can counterattack in the process, provided that he has the speed to do so. And while Reprisal wasn't exactly a good special and still isn't, it was still something that granted extra damage, so it wasn't too bad, especially with Ruda that grants 10 extra damage. Of course, for accessible sword infantries, we had Lok Ku, who had a killing edge, so he was also able to guarantee a special proc, provided that, again, he doubled, but he had 42 speed, which was really, really good. I don't think he was ever going to one-shot anything, but he was always going to double. And then with Vantage, he would always be able to get the first attack on foes, which was pretty good. Although his bulk was never really good to begin with. 45 HP was really good at the start. So overall, Lonku was still pretty decent at the time. Of course, we also have Ogma, who came with a Brave Sword, Noontime, and Defiant Attack. So basically, he was outputting a lot of damage. This is kind of similar to Corel in a sense, where if Defiant Attack were to set up, then he would be able to attack twice before the foe can counter. But Corel had Wudao and Reprisal, which just did more damage in general. And then we had Noah, who was also in a similar vein to Hector and Ryoma, where she could basically counterattack regardless of the foe's range, which was pretty good. However, she didn't have the speed or the guaranteed follow-up, which kind of made her a bit worse. But in fairness, she had good bulk, and dragon effective weaponry weren't really common, and the ones that were pretty much red. So she had pretty good matchups there. And then, of course, we had other units with slang weapons, such as Shanna, who was actually pretty good too, because she had Desperation and Threat and Speed, so she was basically always going to double, provided that Threat and Speed would go off. But because she had Killer Lance and Iceberg, her damage output wouldn't be too bad, but it would require more than one combat, because Iceberg with Killer Lance is only a 2 cooldown special, and if Desperation were active, she wouldn't be able to trigger it otherwise. The same could be said about Perry, but she had Glimmer instead, meaning that it was a lot more consistent. However, she didn't come with Desperation, and her speed was lower, meaning it was a bit harder for her to get damage out overall. She could always enemy phase, but 23 defense wasn't good, and 35 HP was also not great either. But still, she had the ability to do it. And then we had Tharja, who was really speedy. She had good attack too. And Vengeance, not really the greatest, but I mean, it's still a damaging special at the end of the day. The thing about Tharja and all the other Blade Tomes is that at the time, getting visible buffs wasn't exactly easy, but whenever she was buffed, she would get extra damage, which would in turn just make her a really hard-hitting nuke. And of course, there are other combative units. I don't want to go over all of them, mainly because it's just rinse and repeating a lot. But basically, yeah, these units were like pretty much pure combative. Like, they could have supported in some aspects, but I don't think it was nearly good enough to be like a hybrid. Which is why we have other hybrids, such as Barst, who also came with a Brave Axe, meaning that his player phase wasn't too bad. He also had Reposition and Spur Attack, meaning that he could actually allow ranged units to hit and run, which was pretty cool. His defense was actually pretty decent too at 30, so if you needed him to reposition and just take a hit from a melee foe, he could probably do that, but 27 speed against speedier foes would leave him prone to death, which was a problem. But still, the hybrid nature of having reposition was pretty cool. And then we have Sheeta, who's basically a visible buff bot. She had Armor Slayer, which was pretty cool for checking Hector, but I think her main appeal mainly came from rally speed and fortify flyers, especially if you were to use her on a flyer ball, so you would be able to grant visible buffs to 3 of the respective stats, which was pretty cool overall. She also came with Darting Blow, so she could always double in the player phase if you really needed her to. And then we have Dono, who's in a similar position to Bars, but rather than having reposition, he has Reciprocal Aid, meaning that he can actually act as a pseudo-healer, which was a thing I recall happening a lot in the past, where rather than bringing a healer, people would just run Reciprocal Aid with a unit with high HP, so they could actually act in combat too, which was pretty funny. Of course, there's also a weird hybrid with Fa, who had Light Breath, which basically granted visible buffs to herself and allies if she were to engage in combat. But she also had Drawback, which was pretty good, because again, she could just help with hit and run strategies, which was pretty cool. You also had similar units with breaker skills such as Laszlo. Laszlo was never really a good unit until his refined, but because he had Axe Breaker and good attack, he could always check some axe units if he really needed them to, and he could keep himself healthy because of noontime. But he also had Hone Speed, which did allow him to, again, just act supportively and defensively, which is also why he's in the hybrid category. As far as support goes also, there are other means of supporting, such as with chip damage, with Jafar. Jafar had Deathly Dagger, which was just Savage Blow, and his offensive prowess wasn't too bad. He had really good speed and okay attack with life and death. He also came with Glimmer, meaning that he was able to put out a consistent amount of damage provided that he was able to charge it. His bulk was never really good though, but that's to be expected when you're running life and death. But with chip damage, he was also able to act a bit supportively. The same can also be said with Narcian, who had Savage Blow in his C slot. He was basically another Arthur too, but I put him in the hybrid category mainly because of Savage Blows. So basically he could act as a chip bot, and you could have units just swoop in and take kills more easily. And then you had Lynn, who was a really interesting healer, sort of, because her weapon healed allies that were adjacent to herself, and she had Ardent Sacrifice, so she could honestly just act as a combat healer, which was pretty cool. And then she also had Fortify Res, which is just extra stats, which is pretty nice. And then we had Olin, who had Reposition and Dire Thunder. Her attack was never really good, but the fact that she was able to attack twice was pretty nice, and Reposition again just for hit and run strategies was always a good thing. And that's really it for like the hybrid natured ones. The only one I didn't put in hybrid was Erica, which I probably should do, but I feel like her offensive prowess was never really great because Sieglin was just a Hone attack weapon, and she also came with Hone Speed, so basically she could act as a support unit by granting visible buffs. Now I probably should put her in hybrid just because she is able to enter combat, but I just never really was impressed with her combat back then, which is why I have her in support mainly. But I know that logic is flawed, so feel free to roast me in the comments about that one. But outside of that, like, support was basically just healers and dancers, and there really wasn't much else there. And then for the rest of the cast, I just couldn't really find a niche for them. Either their combat prowess was never really good, or they just didn't have really good supportive capabilities of the sort, which is why it was hard to just find a niche for them. Which is why it's just hard to categorize them. But again, this isn't a tier list. This is just a look back at what the meta kind of was back at launch, which again is still kind of flawed because it's been 5 years since launch. Skill Inheritance came out like a month after the game started, so it's really difficult to analyze all this kind of stuff mainly, which is why I don't want you to take this at face value. Rather, I think this should be an interesting discussion point that you guys could probably do in the comments, because honestly it's been a while since launch, so I would like to have like this type of discussion in the comments. But this was pretty much the cast before Skill Inheritance, so not much else to say there. Although if you would like to see more types of videos like this, or if you have other types of topics that you would like me to cover, let me know down below. This was basically my pre-Skill Inheritance list, analysis video, whatever. Again, not a tier list, just something for fun. But until next time, I'll see you later.